Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Luke. It's lovely to be here. So before I get started, I must say, you've probably seen them already. There's my little dogs behind me here. If my front door goes, my dog's going to go and she'll hear a howl. Don't worry, it's fine. He will stop. But you know what it's like working from home. These things we have to deal with. And you may well also see my 3-year-old daughter bounding at any one point. Again, this is the life we are all now in. Okay, that's a couple of things about me. Here's a bit more about me. So my name's Joe Leech, and I am a product and UX coach. And I started my world into psychology. Oh, how many years ago would it have been? I found this book about when I was 15 years old. My mum's a psychologist. And you may have heard me tell this story before, but my mother, she's a psychologist, which, says a lot about me. And I found this book on her bookshelf when I was 15 years old. And this is the book, How to Read a Person Like a Book. And I found this book on my mum's bookshelf and I was like, 15-year-old boy, yes, this is the thing that I need to make my life better. This is exactly what I was missing. The manual for human beings. I saw this book and I thought, great, I'm going to be able to totally be fantastic at the school disco this Friday. I went to the school disco, body language learnt, ready to go, constantly aware of what girls were thinking based on how they were standing and looking, ready for action. How do you think that went, everybody? Do you think I had a good time at that school disco? How do you think my early days of reading psychology and then applying psychology actually went? Tell me in the chat. Did it go well for me? I mean, obviously, I've got a daughter now, so something good must have happened at some point. I did get married at the age of 35. But yeah, it didn't go particularly well for me. And it was an important lesson for me in terms of applying psychology to real life, is you read a theory and then the reality of when you apply that to real life is not necessarily the same. And I'm going to talk a lot about that today, about how you can take something that seems straightforward when you read it in a book, in a paper, on a blog, and then when you try and apply it to the real world design stuff that you're working on, everything changes. Other things you should know about me. I'm an Aries, says a lot about me. And I'm also, if I was a cheese, I would be Swiss cheese. Again, says a lot about me. And following reading that book, I then went and studied neuroscience. So my background is in neuroscience. I then for a few years was a school teacher, hence me talking slightly like a school teacher sometimes. I apologize for that. And then from there, I went and I studied human computer interaction, HCI. So I've got a master's in HCI. I did that about 15 years ago. And from there, I went on and I have worked for larger brands like eBay, Disney. I led the redesign of Marriott.com in 2014 in 38 countries, 18 languages, led the redesign of the train line in 2010, if you know that. I've worked on some really high profile design projects over the years. And I've learned an awful lot about not only running a large project, but also how to apply psychology to the stuff that people are doing out there. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is simply this, is psychology and design, myths, promises, and reality. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about what I've learned, the things that I've learned in my experience of applying psychology to the design world and to real world projects, how that's gone for me, and some experiences that I can share with you. I also obviously now spend my time working with this little fellow at the background here. So I am now a product coach. I help and support organizations basically to do this. So I coach product and UX teams to do the right things in the right order for the right reasons. And I also spend a lot of time helping companies recover when things go really quite badly wrong for them. I wrote a book. I'll talk more about that later on. Again, the best thing about my book is it's cheap and it's short. That's the best feedback I get about my book, but I'll talk about what's in there as we go through, and we do this stuff as we go through anyway. All right. So when I first graduated, picture the scene. There I was fresh out of university. I was working on my first project, which was Veet leg wax. Yes, I know, leg wax. I was in the offices, the very shiny, gleaming offices of an ad agency in London. This was sort of mid-2000s. Ad agencies were just getting their head around the internet at that point. They realized it existed. They weren't very good at it, still arguably not particularly good at it now. But what was happening then was they were starting to realize they needed some support. So I was there as the user guy, the user experience folks to help. And I was there, stood in front of a creative director, and he was presenting to the client about why they should go with this ad agency. And he presented this, which is, as you probably already know, have seen, this is Maslow's hierarchy of need. And he was talking about how, obviously, if you've all come across this before, how Veit Legwax was the pinnacle of self-actualization. And he actually put Veit Legwax at the top of this pyramid. And it made me think, and he was trying to use psychology to advocate a particular design choice that they made. And I was looking at Maslow thinking, I don't recognize this. I don't recognize this from anything that I've studied in neuroscience, nothing I've studied in cognitive psychology, human-computer interaction. I don't understand. I don't see this theory there. It doesn't seem to make much sense to me. So I did what any good researcher would do, and I went back to the source. And I started having a look at Maslow. And what was interesting is I came across this paper. And this paper talks about Maslow, dissects Maslow, and comes up with this clear description. There's no clear empirical evidence for Maslow. Oh, here in comes Nick now, because Nick always hates me blasting Maslow. Hi, Nick. There's no clear empirical evidence for Maslow. And what's interesting about this paper was published in 1976, the same year that I was born. We've had evidence, there's no evidence for Maslow for almost 40 years, 44 years to be exact. Yet this still pops up on design blogs, on psychology blogs, in books, Maslow's hierarchy of need. Fantastic, use this in your design project. We did this because of Maslow's hierarchy of need. I worked with a startup last year that were using Maslow's hierarchy of need. There is no clear evidence for this. There certainly isn't enough evidence or enough thought behind it to base a whole business upon this stuff. And we learned that back in 1976. Maslow's hasn't got any empirical evidence behind it. And when you start looking for this stuff, you see it everywhere. Further on in my career, I came up across a personality test for a job interview I was going for with a big internet company. Would love to tell you the story. In a breakout room later, I will tell you the story of this organization. They got me to do a psychology test. This was the first time I came across Myers-Briggs. And what was interesting about Myers-Briggs is I did that psychology test, and the results that I got were ESTJ. I'll talk about what they mean in a minute. I then did the test with another company about 6 months later, and I got a completely different personality score. And that second test made me think, well, if I'm a different personality each time I take the test, what is the psychological validity of Myers-Briggs? And again, I dug into it. And what's interesting about Myers-Briggs, so Myers-Briggs basically is a binary choice. You are one of these things or you're the other of these things. So you're either introverted or extroverted, sensing or intuitive, thinking or feeling, or judging and perceiving. You know, you can only be thinking or feeling. You can't be both. No, that's ridiculous, says Myers-Briggs. And this is another fundamental problem of crappy psychology, is it seems too simple. It's too simple. It's too straightforward. We humans are not that straightforward. We're not that different, okay? One of us, we are thinking or we are feeling. We're not. Myers-Briggs, that's what Myers-Briggs says. Obviously, there's a continuum. Sometimes in the mornings, I feel like I'm more feeling. In the evenings, maybe I'm a bit more thinking. If I'm feeling a bit tired because my daughter's had me up all night, I'm probably more introverted than I'm extroverted. And again, any evidence you look at for Maslow, Myers-Briggs, there's no evidence behind it. There's no empirical evidence in building the model when Myers and Briggs put this together. There was no evidence from Carl Jung, whose original psychology theories came up with this. Jung was similar to Freud in that he was more of a philosopher than a psychologist. Don't get me wrong, Jung said a lot of interesting things, but again, there was no empirical evidence behind this stuff. So if you're basing a business or a concept or a whole future on this stuff, danger. And the more you look for this stuff, the more you've seen it. This is my least favorite psychology theory of all time. Are you left-brained or are you right-brained? We as user experience people know, hey, we are both of these things. We have attributes from both sides of this. We are not simply creative and fun-loving and analytical. We are both sides of this. It is not as simple as that. And that's the simple and easy way to spot crappy psychology, is it often seems too good to be true, too simple, too easy. I thought that when I was trying to assess body language at that disco when I was 15, I still feel that same way now. I've learned those lessons that nothing is as simple as it seems when it comes to psychology. And what's interesting about something like Myers-Briggs is there is no more scientific validity in it than there is in a BuzzFeed quiz as what kind of cheese are you. Now, don't get me wrong, many of you who've done Myers-Briggs, if any of you have done Myers-Briggs tests, drop in the chat. How did you find that experience? Was it good? Was it bad? How have you found Myers-Briggs? Let me know in the chat. But what's the interesting thing about Myers-Briggs is it's not necessarily that it isn't a helpful thing for you. Because if you look at the questions that are up here too, you can kind of see some of the questions that are here. What these questions are is a way of introspectively looking at yourself. And the same is true of the BuzzFeed "What kind of cheese are you?" quiz. The process of going through and asking yourself these questions in itself is a little bit like counseling. You're interrogating yourself in terms of psychology. So there's some benefit there to you in terms of doing it. But again, there is no scientific validity behind it. And the problem with things like left brain, right brain, Myers-Briggs, all these other personality tests is often these shape our careers because we're put into teams, into jobs that are based upon these things. They're often used in schools to shape what children do in the future. I mean, the thought of my daughter doing something like this, some crappy psychology being used to tell her what her career should be, makes me angry. And people have written whole books upon this. This is a fantastic book called The Cult of Personality Testing that talks about, again, the crappiness of the science behind it, but the dangers of using this stuff in society. So again, with all of this psychology, not only is it risky to use it in terms of a business decision you might be making, but it's also dangerous in terms of your life, your family, your society as a whole, using crappy psychology to base whole organizations around. Dangerous, dangerous stuff. So how do you spot this stuff? How do you spot bad psychology when it's out there? And there's a lot of it out there, let's be honest. Here is a famous study that was done in 1957 by a guy called James Vickers. Now, James Vickers did this fantastic study where he, in a movie theater in the US, he flashed up one frame very quickly: hungry, eat popcorn; thirsty, drink Coca-Cola. He flashed these one frames up, and then he measured alongside a control group how much popcorn or Coca-Cola was drunk at the interval compared to the control group. Do you know what he found? He found that there was a 58% increase in the sales of popcorn and Coca-Cola. Now, you're all smart design psychologists. How does that sound to you? Tell me in the chat. How does that sound to you? Does that sound logical? Valid? Seems like a huge increase for just flashing one frame up on the screen. Is that something that actually happens? Is it true? So what was interesting about James Vickery is in the 80s, he wrote his autobiography. And he, in his autobiography, he wrote, and he admitted to making the whole thing up. There is no such thing as subliminal advertising. It does not work. There is no theory behind it. There is no science behind it. It was made up by an ad executive in the 1950s who, by the way, went on and built a very large advertising company, which he then sold before he wrote his memoirs, to do this stuff. So be careful of this stuff. If it seems too good to be true, like flashing an image up there is going to increase your sales by 58%, it's probably not going to work. And you as good design psychologists should know that. You should be able to go out there and sniff when some of these things are wrong, when some of this stuff doesn't feel right. And back in 2015, Professor Brian Nosek took this kind of stuff head on. And he published a landmark study, which I'll talk about in a minute, but he talked about some of the failings within psychology. And he focused on this one problem. We focused on getting it published over getting it right. And this has been true of psychology, certainly over the last 20 years or so. And if right back to the 1950s, if you look at James Vickery, where psychologists have wanted to get on the front of them, to get some space on the Daily Mail or in Metro or on a design blog. They want to get PR and publicity for everything that they do. I'll talk about some titles of some psychology experiments and some papers later on, which are perfect media bait to get out there. And, if you're a career psychologist, getting yourself in the newspapers is a pat on the back for you. Getting published is a goal, and you're measured on being published, not necessarily on being right. And Professor Brian Nosek took this head on. And in doing that, he uncovered quite a lot of interesting things. He did this study in 2015. There's quite a landmark paper that was published. Any of you read this? Let me know in the chat if you've read this paper. Interesting paper that you should all certainly go and read up of this. And he put together this team called this approach called the Reproducibility Project. It's 270 psychologists, and they aim to replicate 100 psychology studies. And what was interesting is they went through and they looked to replicate these 100 studies. How do you think it went? They found that actually statistically, the statistics of some of the original studies were right. So 97% of the original results showed a statistically significant effect, but only 36% of those could be reproduced. There was a reproducibility problem that he identified. They set things up in the same way. They set experiments up in the same way. They could not reproduce the original findings that those teams had put together. Obviously, from psychology, this is a huge landmark issue in terms of that. And it's become recently known as the replication crisis. And it was huge. And many of the famous psychology studies that we kind of have sort of taken for granted were debunked. So things like the cues of being watched. So we're more honest and more truthful if people are watching us. Again, not easily replicated. In fact, not replicated. The jam study, I've talked about this one, where users were given the choice between 6 and 30 jams at a farmer's market over consecutive Saturdays. The researchers found that people bought more jam when there was less choice. So when there were 6 choices of jam, more jam was sold than there were 30. Okay, this is again very famous paper, again with a media baity title as well. Can too much of a good thing choice? Can too much of a good thing be demotivating? Again, published widely out there in the media, not repeatable through this project. Ego depletion. So this idea that we only have a certain amount of willpower, and by putting a plate of biscuits in front of us on the table and told not to eat them, we somehow deplete our willpower and we can't do willpower tasks in the future, like concentrating on work. Again, not reproduced. No evidence that there is anything here with ego depletion. All of the priming studies that were done, so there's a huge number of priming psychology studies that, again, you probably read about and you're still reading about now in design blogs, like watching old people walk. They showed people videos of old people walking and then watched them walk afterwards, and so showed that they were somehow walking more slowly and more hunched over. Again, not repeatable. There was no evidence necessarily that there was an effect here. Other things like making people think about money makes them selfish. More priming, no, not repeated, no evidence for it from the second set of experiments done on this stuff. Cues, this is an interesting one as well about making people smile. So trying to make people smile and seeing if they seem happier. Again, didn't replicate. There was no replication behind this. So making people smile didn't necessarily make them happier. That was the original study. Other things like, oh, this is my dog again. Hello. This is a little dude, by the way, my dog. Thinking about hot weather somehow makes you believe more in global warming. Again, priming, no scientific evidence for it. I've worked and have been approached by startups that are trying to use priming to do things like increase sales on e-commerce websites. They're building their whole business around a psychology theory that was debunked 5 years ago because they read it on the blog. They didn't go through the rigor of going back and looking at that study and anything else that happened with that study to see if it was still valid. This is a fantastic one. This is the Lady Macbeth effect, where a priming effect again. So what people, if they've been a feeling of shame, they do more cleaning. So if you feel ashamed or you're made to feel ashamed, you end up wanting to be more clean. Again, not repeated. Famously, a famous study, again, all over the media, not repeated. Further work was done. So another group of psychologists went ahead and did this as well from the Social Sciences Replication Project. They're on an even larger study. Again, they looked at studies between 2010 and 2015 from both Nature and Science, two very high-profile journals of science, and specifically in things like experimental and behavioral psychology. They couldn't repeat. 62% of them, they could not repeat and get the same results. They beefed up these studies. They did more with more users and a better, more participants. They made them more valid. They checked and improved the method of these studies. But again, only 62% of them could be repeated. 38% of them could not. And that says a lot for a lot of the psychology that we might want to end up using in the projects we're working on. So how do you arm yourself for this kind of stuff? What do you do? Here's some things you can do. So anytime you are looking at a psychology study, go and read the paper. I talk about this in my book, How to Read a Psychology Paper. And I'm running a workshop next week as part of this conference. And again, in that, I talk about finding psychology, assessing if it's valid or not, and then applying it to the work you might be doing. So simple things that can tell you if it's not particularly valid, even if it, low sample size, okay? Statistically weak. I don't expect you to go into the relevance of statistical significance. It's a complicated thing in itself. But again, these are some of the hallmarks of them. Often these studies were done in a single place, a single study, a single cohort. So generally the worst kinds of psychology papers are done on psychology undergraduates in psychology departments. So often you'll read the paper and they'll be like, so the psychology experiment on undergraduates that they're surrounded by in the psychology department. I wonder if that's representative of the global population as a whole. Interesting. And again, often you'll see them fudging around with the data. They'll be doing some fuzzy stuff in the method around the data. They're trying to use different statistical tests to come up with different validity in different areas. They're swapping out one test for another test to finally get a test that tells them that this is statistically valid or not. They're fuzzing around with the data. And equally, they only ever publish positive results. So you're never going to see a negative result where we tried this and we didn't find anything. Those studies simply don't get published because they're not interesting to the journals. They're not interesting to somebody's career. The negative studies never get published. And that's a real shame because often the negatives can be as interesting as the positives themselves. And Professor Nosek talks about this idea of organized skepticism. So he, as part of his part of the team he's been working with, he talks around just being skeptical of everything that people are doing, right through to the organizations that are funding this science, through to the universities themselves, the departments, just being skeptical at every single point to make sure bias has not been introduced. And I'm suggesting you folks as a whole take that on too, is you become skeptical of every psychology study that somebody tells you about today. And that's mine included. Anything that you read from me, you go, is that valid, Joe? Have you read the paper? Have you gone back and had a look at that? You take that on. Anything you read about psychology in the future, go back to the source, check the source. Be skeptical. Don't take it on just because you've read it in somebody's book, my book included. There's other places you can look. This is the Psych File Drawer, which is a fantastic website that helps to talk about and lists basically a lot of the studies that have not been reproduced in that way. It's also got discussions about lots of studies that may suffer from this as well. So they talk a lot about, you can see they've got huge numbers here. You can see they've got discussions about certain things as well. So if there's a study you're interested in, go and have a look here. And you can at least read the discussions to see what other scientists think about that study. Get yourself armed for this stuff in the future. And again, if you're basing a new initiative in the company, a whole startup on this stuff, be careful. That's a dangerous place to be, just basing everything you're doing on one psychology study. I've worked with numerous startups that have tried that. Some have worked, don't get me wrong. I'm working with one at the moment that's doing that around behavioral change. So using food to cure people of diabetes using behavioral change. There's science there, but it's not going to be an easy thing for them to be able to do. Look for these kinds of logos on the researchers' websites or even in the papers themselves. So there's two sets of approaches here. So you've got some stuff from the Social Sciences Replication Project top here, and then we've got the Reproducibility Project at the bottom as well. So go and have a look for these logos to see if, again, the scientists behind this are doing the work in the open. And what these logos basically mean is those scientists, these researchers and psychologists are doing all of their experimental planning in the open. They're saying to our colleagues, hey, this is how we think we might run this experiment. What do you think? They're doing, rather than waiting to be published and critique happening afterwards, they're doing all of that critique ahead of time. So the actual method of the psychology before it starts the experiment is better, through these programs of open data, open materials, pre-registering, and open discussions about the work that they're doing. Important stuff. So what does that take us? I've kind of basically told you, don't believe anything that you read. What does that mean practically from your day-to-day job? So what to do? Here's my experiences of doing this. I'm going to ask you a question. Hands up then. So have any of you, have you had a smoke in the last 2 years? Sneaky little cigarette, maybe a little drag on a cigarette at a party? Tried somebody's vape just once, perhaps? Anybody done that? Let me know in the chat. Have you done this? Anybody done this? Had a little sneaky little chat? Yeah, see, some of you have. Okay, that's fine. You know, Nick's smoking right now. Love that. Maybe you have just a quick smoke. You're not smokers, but you just had a little, you know, a party or whatever. You've just done that. Simple. Some yeses, some nos. Okay. You know, simple question. I'm asking you that. Right. What if this question was on a life insurance website? So you're applying for life insurance here. Maybe as part of a job you've just been offered, or as part of your employee screen. Would you do this? Would you go through and say, oh, yeah, do you know what? Yes, I did. I did have that smoke at that party 2 years ago. Do you know what? I did do that. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I did. Are you going to be as honest in terms of doing that on this form? Lots of no nevers, no nevers. Of course you're not. And that's the challenge with a lot of this stuff, is in the context. Different context means you operate and work differently. Now, I mentioned a study earlier on that might give you some insight into this. So I worked on this project about 10 years ago. And again, what happens if people lie on this is that, obviously, because again, if you lie, if you say, oh, no, if you say yes, your premium's going to go up. But what tends to happen is everybody lies, the premiums go up for everybody. So there's a kind of an underlying effect. It's effectively the prisoner's dilemma, sort of on a larger scale with insurance. So we were tasked with, how can we improve the honesty of this question? How can we do that? And what was interesting at the time of this is this was a famous TV advert was running for this insurance at any one time. So guess what we did? Here's what we did. And it worked. We put June Whitfield on the website. So she was the face of this particular product. You can probably guess what it is by now. And we put here on here. We did some photography. You got a very stern photo of her looking at the camera like this, looking a little bit reproachful. Did you really? We didn't obviously put it here quite like that. We put it close to this question just to see. And we ran an A/B test to see which one of these two would perform better, with or without. Which one do you get more honesty on? And what do you think? What do you think came through when we put June Whitfield on here? Hey, do you know what? Yeah, more people were honest. Now, I told you before, if you're watching, I showed you that example of that policeman cut out by the shop, that experiment could not be repeated. It couldn't be repeated. Yet here's me repeating that experiment and getting positive results. It did work for us. And what was interesting about this as well is June left the advertising and they got Michael Parkinson in instead. Michael Parkinson didn't make people as honest as June Whitfield. Design a tip for you. Again, anyway. But what I'm telling you is that there is still validity in you using this stuff. So you can still go out there and use this stuff in the real world. I know the two questions are very different, but I'm asking the same question in the same way. And what's interesting about these two things is that I got repeatability. We got results. The business saw results from doing this stuff. Because again, it's all dependent on the context that you're operating in. Okay. So anytime you read a paper like Accused of Being Watched, that was done in a psychology department, honesty around milk, giving somebody an honesty box for using milk. It worked in that environment. It worked in the environment I was working on with June Whitfield on this insurance program online. It didn't work in many of the other environments that the repeatability project looked at. And what that tells us is, and this is back to that learning that I had with that book, those body language cues, trying to read the cues of an feeling extremely awkward teenager whose sort of arms are all over the place, who doesn't need to hold their arms anyway, you're not going to be able to understand the body language cues. Yet you can watch the body language cues if you watch the Frost-Nixon interview, the famous Frost-Nixon interview. You can see the body language of those two people being used adversarially against each other. You can see it from the executive in your meetings who leans all the way back with his arms behind his back and his midriff in the air. There is validity to body language, but you cannot predictably use body language to get results 100% of the time. And that's the takeaway from this. Just because you read it, go and look at the study and try it. Try it for yourself to see if this is possible. And again, from a research point of view, you're all good user researchers. Which of these two research methods is going to work for design psychology? Asking people, so would you be more honest if there's a picture of June Whitfield there or not? User research studies, or do you run an A/B test? Which of these two is going to be a more valid way of you testing the results of using design psychology? Have a guess. I mean, completely right. A/B testing every single time is going to give you better research understanding of if this is a valid theory or not. Again, because often a lot of psychology operates at the subconscious level. You can't ask people if this is going to work for you. You have to run A/B testing. So as a design psychologist, A/B testing is your friend. Okay, you can use it to your best efficiency. Yes, it can be a bit grubby. Yes, it can be a bit dirty. But again, that's the world we get into with psychology as a whole anyway. Okay, so to wrap up then, be skeptical. All right. Anytime you read anything, be skeptical. You read it in a blog, you read it in a newspaper, go back to the source, read that paper, go and check Psych File Drawer, go and check for repeatability. Type the name of that paper, add the word repeatability. Don't base your whole business, your whole product, your whole initiative on one psychology theory and expect it to work. There is no 100% guarantee, even in the studies that have been reproduced, are going to work for you. They might, but you can't be sure, which brings us back to A/B testing. A/B testing is going to tell you if it works or not. And obviously you can play around with the subtleties of asking the question in a different way, of doing things in a different way to get different results from that. But A/B testing is your friend when it comes to applying psychology to some of the work you're doing. You cannot be sure until you launch something out there with real people if it's going to work or not. Based on design psychology, you simply can't do that. And a lot of businesses love that certainty. And unfortunately, when it comes to design psychology, you cannot be sure, 100% sure that it's going to work for you. Be skeptical. Don't base your business on one idea, and A/B test everything, folks. Okay. Hey, always got to have an uplifting quote in everything that you do. You're going to be much better at what you do if you understand the psychological underpinnings of what your users are trying to do. And that's not only what your users are trying to think, but the theoretical way that psychology papers are put together. I'll talk about that in my workshop next week. I talk about that in my book. You need to understand how a psychology paper, if it's valid or not, if it's repeatable or not. You need to know how to be really good at design psychology and really, be able to apply it properly. You need to understand how well those theories and studies have been put together. Hey, screen grab that, stick that on Twitter with me, would you? People always ask me who this quote is by. It's from me. Anyway, let's keep going. Resources. I've got this site called Psychology for Designers. My slides are here as well. mrjoe.uk/sci. I write a lot about design psychology on Psychology for Designers. I just talking about habit forming here last week. I've got a huge number of bookmarks for everything that you've read today. I've bookmarked extensively here. You can see I've also referenced everything in this presentation on the slides. You can get those slides there in the mrjoe.uk/sci. mrjoe.uk/sci. There. Go and grab the slides now and grab and read everything that you need to read from me today. So thank you very much, everybody.